Hi, I'm going to do a two-part um, video here on the history of the beginnings of the Victor Talking Machine Company. It's a very complex matter, and there was an awful lot going on, and I don't know whether I can explain it to you in 20 minutes or not, but I will do my best. If we talk about the Victor Talking Machine Company at all, it has to go all the way back to the Berliner Gramophone. Now, the Berliner Gramophone record was a disc record, and I'm going to use props here. I brought some records along and to let you see how this all progressed. The Berliner Gramophone was an acid-etched disc. They would record onto a zinc master, immerse the zinc master in acid, and then from that master they could create a stamper and then stamp out hard rubber, later kind of a shellac, hard rubber, graphite mixture, and and they were actually rather inexpensive. This is a Berliner gramophone disc. This is from about 1896, 1897, played by William Paris Chambers, who was a very famous cornetist at the time. The Berliner gramophone was remarkably successful. Um, for several reasons. They advertised well. They also did demonstrations. And lastly, Berliner hired a marketing agent by the name of Frank Seaman. And Frank Seaman was a genius. He was really good at advertising. He was a Wall Street advertiser, so he was really with it. The problem was the Berliner gramophone machine did not have a spring, was not electric, not like the cylinder machines. The cylinder machines by 1895, 1896 were either battery powered or spring powered, but they were very expensive. And this was where Berliner was looking to see if he could make his mark by cutting into the market by offering a cheap machine and cheap records. And so the Berliner company started recording like crazy. They were originally based in Washington, and actually they made a whole mess of recordings of government workers. Government workers made lots of recordings for Columbia and Berliner, and eventually moved their offices up to Philadelphia and New York. He was trying to improve the machine, wasn't very successful. He was asking inventors to develop springs. Every spring that came that worked was too expensive, and the ones that were cheap were usually too weak. And so by chance, one fellow was putting in a spring that was very complex, but it was manufactured for him by a young mechanic by the name of Eldridge Reeves Johnson. Well, the spring came to Berliner. Berliner turned it down, and it ended up going back to Johnson, just sitting there. And Johnson became curious. And so he fiddled with that spring and removed a third of its components. And then he presented it back to Berliner. And Berliner was delighted and hired Johnson to start manufacturing these springs for the improved gramophone. And it was an incredibly successful venture. By 1896, 1897, the gramophone business was moving. Seaman was selling, Berliner was thinking and creating, and of course Johnson was making the machines. This all ran well until about 1898, early 1899, when Frank Seaman was not exactly happy about the deal that had been made. They worked out a deal in 1896. It was for 15 years. It was to go on till 1911. And that was basically for marketing the discs. And the deal wasn't the greatest. And so, Seaman went to Berliner and said, hey, I have really brought this business along a lot. I think I deserve a better cut. Berliner basically said a deal's a deal. And this got Seaman not too happy. Now you also have to understand, on the other side of the coin, the cylinder machine companies weren't very happy about this either. And so they were looking at it with undisguised alarm. And it was the Columbia Graphophone Company, which was inherited of the patents of Bell and Tainter, that started to challenge the Berliner Group. The Columbia Company had a phenomenal lawyer by the name of Philip Morro. Genius, absolute genius. And one of the major patents for the Bell-Tainter graphophone, which is phonograph spoonerized, just so you know, just to annoy Edison, was a needle moved by a groove. And what this basically talked about was the gearing system of the machine to move the needle across the record. But Philip Morro played with this. And he took a Berliner record, and he said, if I put a needle on this, the groove moves the needle. And so it's a needle moved by a groove. And with that flimsy argument, he brought that to court, and they forced an injunction upon the Berliner Company, assisted by Frank Seaman. In fact, at that point, the Columbia Company said, Frank Seaman, we have nothing against you. In fact, Frank Seaman was working on his own company at this point, called the Zonophone. Here's a Zonophone record. See if I can do this in a good fashion. The Zonophone record, manufactured by Frank Seaman. Basically, if you look at it, it's just a glorified Berliner record. In many cases, they were Berliner records, pirated. So Berliner was out of business, at least for the moment. This hurt one person more than anyone else, and that was Eldridge Reeves Johnson, because he was manufacturing everything for Berliner. And he had just built a massive factory, put all of his money into it to manufacture more Berliner parts. And suddenly the orders stopped. Well, he was forced, because his creditors were banging at the door, to come up with his own record. He had been experimenting with something called wax recording. Had not patented the idea yet, but he was experimenting. And so the recordings that he had made in experimentation were implemented and pushed, and they did more enhancements, and then came out with their record, which doesn't say anything about anybody, but it was called the Improved Gramophone Record, manufactured by the Consolidated Talking Machine Company. It came with this little sticker on the back. Well, they were wildly successful. Now, let me explain what wildly successful was. They sold some records. It wasn't a massive amount, but it was a trickle, a start. And so Johnson started in the gramophone business. This was not looked at kindly by the Columbia Graphophone or Frank Seaman. And these two entities went to work to destroy Eldridge Johnson and his newfound business called the Consolidated Talking Machine Company of Philadelphia. Here's where I'm going to stop, and we'll go to part 2.